Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at the technology used on the battlefields of World War One. Now, when looking at technology, we need to think of three things: how it affected the nature of the war, and how it affected the war's outcome, both with regard to who won and who lost, and with regard to how it affected civilians as well as combatants. But of course, we have to think of the technology. Now, I say of course, but actually examiners' comments for past exams have frequently pointed out how weak many candidates are when it comes to just what is meant by technology. So here goes. Before assessing the impact of different weaponry, it's worthwhile giving a little consideration to something essential in the heat of battle if any strategy is to prove effective: communications. And in World War I, communication was very difficult. Radio was in its infancy, and telephone lines were often cut by artillery fire. So, messages had to be sent back and forth by messengers or runners. Hitler was undoubtedly the most famous, often crossing each other in mid-journey. This led to confusion, sometimes with tragic consequences. Artillery had developed considerably in the second half of the 19th century. But in the expectation of fast-moving mobile warfare, most of the development had been in light, quick-firing field guns, designed to support the infantry with shrapnel fire as they attacked. However, these guns had a low trajectory, and so found it difficult to destroy trenches and dugouts. So once the war on the Western Front literally dug in and became a static war, heavy artillery, howitzers, with the ability to drop high explosive shells into trench systems or to explode shrapnel above them, were rapidly developed and produced in large numbers. Artillery now had the advantage of firing at virtually fixed positions. This meant that artillery units could themselves take up permanent positions, where success could be more assured. From these positions, they accounted for somewhere between 60 and 70% of all casualties. This is hardly surprising when one considers the millions of shells that rained down on the troops. Yet, though a stretch of a trench might be destroyed by a direct hit, and the biggest loss of life was the result of artillery fire, the trench system itself was not destroyed, and nor was the system of barbed wire in front of them, and many, many more men survived than were killed. And the best way to use artillery had to be worked out. The mass barrage, still being used in 1917 at Passchendaele, was a signal that an attack was about to take place. The enemy could protect themselves as best they could, knowing that the attack would not commence until the barrage stopped. At the same time, the bombardment would turn no man's land into a quagmire, particularly after rain. And it rains a lot in Western Europe. So, different types of bombardment were tried. The on-off bombardment of the Brusilov offensive in the summer of 1916, across a massive front, so that the enemy wouldn't know where the main attack was coming from. The creeping or rolling barrage was developed on the Western Front again in 1916, carefully timed and targeted to move ahead of the advancing troops. not necessarily with the intent of destroying the enemy's defences, but keeping them from their firing positions. This could develop into a curtain barrage to protect men if a trench was taken. In 1918, in the Ludendorff offensive, the Germans forsook the prolonged barrage and opted for a hurricane barrage, hitting the enemy with everything they had just 30 minutes before they attacked. Hurricane barrages had been used before, but in coordination with the prolonged barrages. Predicted fire was also developed as a tactic. This used reconnaissance and maps to target specific positions, the enemy's artillery or other strong points in their defences, or else command posts and their communications. By the end of the war, they benefited from air reconnaissance, as well as flash spotting and sound ranging, all of which helped the identification and accurate targeting of key enemy positions. These were mapped out into zones, and as the battle unfolded, zone calls from spotters would direct artillery fire to where positions of strength still survived. But of course, communications needed to be intact. The machine gun, which could fire 500 to 600 rounds a minute, 30 times more than the very best rifle, coupled with barbed wire, were formidable defensive weapons, accounting for millions of casualties. I always think of the machine gun and barbed wire together, for it was the combination of the two that was extra deadly. British generals were unconvinced as to their worth. General Haig had told Lloyd George that the machine gun was a much overrated weapon and that 2 per battalion were more than sufficient, while Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, thought 4 would be sufficient. Lloyd George, as Minister of Munitions, thought very differently though. Take Kitchener's maximum, square it, multiply that result by 2, and when you're in sight of that, double it again for good luck. That's what he thought. But that they were the most effective weapon in the war should not be in doubt. With the Entente powers attacking more, they were fighting on French soil, the Germans developed the art of defending with the machine gun particularly well, creating strong points by using farms and villages, or building very well protected machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire. But they were heavy and needed to be mounted on a tripod, itself heavy and cumbersome. Consequently, they remained for most of the war essentially a defensive weapon. Not until later in the war were lighter machine guns that could be used as offensive weapons manufactured. Now, of the 2 new weapons on the battlefield, the tank did not have a great impact in World War I, so I'm not going to include it in this presentation. But another new weapon certainly did. In the spring of 1915, the new German Chief of Staff, Falkenhayn, was depleted of troops when men were sent to the Eastern Front, and was also short of ammunition. So, in the Second Battle of Ypres, he decided to compensate his losses by deploying for the first time in a concerted way a new weapon, chlorine gas. The attack caused 15,000 casualties, of whom 5,000 died. But the Germans were themselves taken by surprise by the success of the attack and failed to take advantage. It had been an experiment. Within a matter of days, the Entente troops were supplied with crude respirators, or gas masks, linen masks with the instruction to moisten them, if necessary, with their own urine. In time, more effective gas masks were issued. There were problems for the Germans too, as to take advantage, their troops found that they had to advance into the clouds of gas they had released. While if the wind changed, the gas would be blown back towards their own trenches. But tactics improved. A clever yet simple tactic devised by the Germans to counter the deployment of gas masks was to first shell the enemy lines with sneezing powder, or else tear gas, which seeped through the gas masks and forced their removal. Then the lines would be shelled with deadly gas. Another ploy used by the Germans was to shell a sector with gas at night. The enemy would don their gas masks until the vapours had settled into the ground. But when the sun rose and the earth warmed up, the vapours would rise and poison the unprotected troops. Phosgene gas, introduced a little later, was 10 times more toxic than chlorine and consequently proved more lethal. Mustard gas, however, first used in 1917, had even worse effects. And being both colourless and odourless, it was difficult to detect before it was already wreaking its deadly effect. All 3 forms of gas led to agonising deaths, and in total 800,000 casualties from both sides were a result of gas and other chemical warfare. However, gas did not lead to any decisive breakthroughs, and, as I've hinted, both sides used it. The respirators were effective, and in any case, as we've noted, the wind could blow the gas in any direction, even back towards the lines deploying it. So, an overview of the weapons of the battlefields that I hope proves useful for you. Remember, you want to be thinking about their effect on the nature of the war, a defensive, attritional war, yet indecisive, and so contributing to prolonging the war, and their contribution to outcomes. They were deadly, and the side with most men was always more likely to win a war of attrition. Don't forget to check out my website, History Made Easier, if you haven't done so already. That's there to help you too. But for now, let me thank you so much for listening and wish you the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.